Sojourner Truth was a formerly enslaved woman who became one of the most powerful voices for justice in history. Known for activism and powerful speeches, she also fought for both the abolition of slavery and for women's rights. Today, I will be discussing her journey from slavery to freedom and her activism in abolition and rights for women. To begin, I'd like to share a quote from Sojourner Truth's speech, her Ain't I Woman speech she gave in 1851. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. Before she was known for her powerful speeches, Sojourner Truth had to overcome a lot. She overcame hardships and became one of the most potent female orators there is today. So let's start with how her journey began. She was born as Isabella Baumfree in 1797 in New York, and she was enslaved with her family. She was sold multiple times and endured physical and emotional abuse. She escaped in 1826 with her infant daughter. She took the name Sojourner Truth in 1843 to reflect her spiritual mission. Her experiences with injustice gave her a powerful voice for others facing oppression. I'd like to include that when she escaped slavery, her son was sold into slavery illegally out of the state. Woman in the American Story states she sprang into action, demanding that the local law enforcement get her son back. She gave public speeches in Kingston, New York, explaining the cruelties of slavery to any white person who would listen. She finally succeeded in regaining her custody of her son, but Peter, her son, never recovered from the cruelty and terror he experienced while enslaved in the Deep South. Once free, she began using that voice to fight for change, especially in the abolition and women's rights movements. This is what triggered her spiritual awakening and began her journey. Next, I'd like to talk about her activism in abolition against slavery and her activism in women's rights. Sojourner Truth's activism for abolition and women's rights. Here are some points. She began speaking in churches and public meetings, becoming one of the first Black women to speak publicly on major social issues. She delivered her famous Ain't I Woman speech in 1851. She advocated for the end of slavery and equal rights for Black people and women, worked with Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists, and she continued to speak after the Civil War, promoting civil rights for women's suffrage. I'd like to add that, as well as abolitionists, she worked with activists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. This quote says she met women's rights activists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, as well as temperance advocates, both causes she quickly championed. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the accomplishments she overcame. She spoke at the first National Women's Rights Convention in 1850, and in 1851, at age 54, delivered a famed speech at the Akron Women's Rights Convention. She worked for the Freedmen's Bureau during the Civil War, and she also gave troop supplies during this time. In general, she overcame the challenges of slavery, illiteracy, penury, prejudice, and sexism in her own lifetime. One last quote that I would like to speak on is from the narrative of Sojourner Truth, and it's specifically from the appendix written by Olive Gilbert. It says, "She hopes and believes that all their names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life, and that the sweet communion begun in time will continue when time shall be no more." Olive Gilbert helped publish Truth's autobiography. This line shows what kind of character Truth is. It reflects her Christian faith and her hope for eternal unity with others who shared her spiritual journey. I'd like to also talk about a segment in the narrative of Sojourner Truth, It speaks on her joining a meeting in a church with other people from other religions. And she was hushed by everyone when she came in and felt very unwelcomed because of the color of her skin. But she spoke up no matter what, and she gave her word knowing that she was looked down upon. And this shows what type of woman she was. The narrative of Sojourner Truth has a lot of these types of stories, and it describes what type of woman she was and that she would fight for anyone no matter what. To conclude, Sojourner Truth's life was a powerful example of strength, courage, and purpose despite the obstacles that tried to hold her back. From escaping slavery to becoming a voice for justice, she broke barriers and inspired change. Her legacy reminds us that one voice can make a lasting difference in the fight for equality. Thank you.